Hello and welcome to Exchanges in a new format. We're going to be bringing you what's called Around the Exchange, where we dive into your questions, your thoughts, and what is clearly moving you in your region and in the world around the economics, behavior, and everything else in between that is happening to us. Before we get into the first episode of Around the Exchange, today's episode is brought to you by More, the Lifestyle by Design app designed to manage your portfolio to give you the lifestyle that you want into the future. It gives you everything that you need at the tip of your fingertips. Download the More app today to understand exactly how you can get a lifestyle by design. So, first and foremost, the number one thing that clearly is on your mind is Iran. And Iran will continue to be on your mind for the rest of 2026. It is very hard to make an argument that that is not going to be where we are at. There is already signs that the changes to global fuel supply is going to get geopolitical. It is clearly going to get nationalistic. And as I talked to you over the weekend and on Friday, we actually saw the Chinese look like actually stockpiling jet fuel. And for an Australian-centric point of view, that is a concern, considering that the majority of our jet fuel gets refined in that part of the world. Then the impact of also what it's going to do for transportation, what it's going to do for diesel, what it's going to go for the general energy mix that we have. That is the panic that we currently see. You can see it through everything that we do. It's completely understandable in terms of the reactions that we've seen. It has very much the hallmarks of 2022 when the horrible events of the Russian-Ukrainian war kicked off. Now we've got the US-Iran war, all of that together. If you look at it, it's pretty stereotypical in terms of how we're reacting. And that's by the by. What I more am concerned about, and where it comes back to the next point, is actually what might have been lost last week in the news cycle around this, is that this gets back to what was also seen last week, is that consumer expectations of inflation are starting to rally again. And on a 6-month rolling average, according to NAB, it's now at 4.7%. On a 3-month rolling average, according to ANZ, it's at 4.6%. And overall, we all think it's going to be in the 4s. Even Treasury late last week leaked out that it is now wargaming the idea that inflation in Australia at the headline, so that includes food, fuel, all of the volatile items that normally get stripped out, are going to start surging again. They're going to be at 4% something, and 4%, 6, 7, 8, or 9 is clearly where we have it. What that is meaning is that you're already thinking about A, what does that mean for my household budget? B, what does it also mean around my ability to do what I want, when I want, how I want? And C, this is the more important one, do I need to actually start changing my behavior? And I would actually argue we've already seen this, because if you look at the GDP figures, so the gross domestic product figures that came out a week and a half ago, the consumer was already actually starting to show signs that are slowing down. Yes, you can put the energy rebate into that. There actually was a contractor, and that's the nuffy boffin economic side of it. But I think it's more than that. I think the consumer knows that this year is going to be different. And that brings me to the bigger point that's going on. There is also very clearly communication coming out from the RBA, which is meeting tomorrow for when this is being recorded, that this event is live. You have seen Andrew Husser, who is the deputy. You've also seen Sarah Hunter, who is the chief economist. They have been talking about this. And then Michelle Bullock herself, in the governor, had also been interviewed in the last couple of weeks, suggesting that the Tuesday meeting in March is a live event. And so this gets me first and foremost to your question. I got this question that came in from Rachel, and Rachel asks, Evan, can you please help us to understand why raising the cash rate and in turn interest rates is the only economic lever that we seem to have? It seems to be getting great for the banks as their shareholders make more profits, margins grow off the back of everyday homeowners. So why isn't there some other way? I seriously would prefer to pay more GST at least than go back into the coffers of the banks. Eventually, this is going to come back and hurt community spending. Rachel, great question, and thank you so much for it. I need to sort of break it down. So first and foremost, let's go around private banks, central bank. They're two separate entities. The central bank has one lever, which you've already alluded to, which is the cash rate, the movements of interest rates. That is monetary policy, and they only have one lever. Before I answer why they use this lever, the way I'd explain it is that they have a sledgehammer to do fine art. But the reason it's used and the reason it works are probably four things. It's a multiple channel impactor simultaneously. So as I said, sledgehammer to do fine art, it single changes, hits everything. Borrowing costs, mortgage repayments, business investment decisions, exchange rates, asset prices all get hit at the same time, positively and negatively for when you move rates up or you move rates down. It's fast, and that is also part and parcel with this. Monetary policy is actually quite quick. It does take months to move through the system, but it is much, much faster than the other mechanisms I'll come to in a minute. The other thing about it is it's also, as fast as it goes in, it's as fast to come out. So it's reversible. So rate hikes can be cut. Rate cuts can be hiked. So the ability to move the lever is much, much faster than other mechanisms as well. It's politically independent. It is not influenced by the expediency of the electorate. It is impacted by the very, very hard data in front of them. It is technocrats. And because of that, they therefore don't have to foresee to the constituency what needs to happen. Now, there's pros and cons to that, completely understand it, but it does therefore move in the respect that it needs to do the hard decision-making, which we had seen through 2023 to 2024, and then the slightly easier one when they cut rates through 2025. We're in a hard cycle right now. The other one is that it also anchors expectations. If you know what they're going to do, that if they know that they have got a mandate to set rates to make sure they have full employment, the outlook for the Australian people, and an exchange rate that is relatively even, that's inflation, that's their three mandates: full employment, GDP, and inflation. That therefore gives them a very, very anchored expectation. It's why their goal is to keep inflation between 2 and 3% to make sure that they don't overly impacts growth, that it's humming along at a sustainable level without pushing prices up. Productivity brings into that. But all of these are predictable mechanisms. There are predictable numbers. That is the technical argument and theoretical argument around central banks. Now, the real world, the hard-nosed real world, doesn't work like that. And that is completely understandable by your question, because how do you therefore move the hike into the actual electorate? How do you move it into the economy? Well, clearly banks on the private side, which lend to businesses, which lend to homeowners, which lend to all of you out there, they are the ones that take the central bank interest rates, put a margin on it, and then lend it to you. That's how banking works. They go to creditors, put a margin, lend it out. That's why if you look at their profits, if you look at their profit in terms of what it is massive, and I'm not hesitating to say that's all it is, but if you look at what their margin is, it's about between 1.5 and as high as 2.1, depending on which bank you want to look at. So the margins aren't exactly huge, but because of the amount that they lend, the profit they make in the end is rather massive. What it is doing though, and another way to say it to you, is that monetary policy increases or decreases the amount of lending capacity in the country, of whatever country it happens to be. The reason that works is that if you take money out, it therefore decreases supply, it decreases demand, and will ultimately decrease inflation. In argument to your question around why don't put that in capital gains tax, in goods and services tax, it's a great question. This is a debate that's been going on for quite a while, and a debate that is actually filtered into not just something like looking at paying extra tax and something like goods and services tax. It's also been argued about why don't we actually force people to put more money into things like super, rather than actually putting it into the banks. If we were forcing more pay packets that's not going directly into the economy now into your savings, isn't that a good thing? To some extent, no, because what you're also doing on the flip side, the behavioral, is you're creating a wealth effect. You're actually increasing people's wealth by putting their money not into the economy that they can directly spend. You're putting into savings and investments that grows. Now, that sounds like a great idea, and I can understand that, but it actually probably kicks the can down the road. The impact of inflation goes down further, because once in the future they retire and they can actually withdraw that money, they're going to have a significantly larger savings balance that they can spend faster, harder, and stronger in the economy, pushing up demand. This is the catch with all of this debate. It's a circular debate. There is no right answer. And I think the system we've got is as neat as we can get it. It's not perfect. It never will be. The other side of this, and part of your question that came from Rachel, was why don't they use something else? Well, there is another player in this, and that's fiscal policy, and that's government. And that's why the May budget, which is the final thing I want to look at for exchanges this week, is The May budget has got the most amount of buzz around it I can remember. The possibility of reform is getting louder and louder. And fiscal budgets and fiscal impact into monetary numbers is much, much more effective because it's finer. You can actually target it. You can move the dial much easier. The caveat is, just like I said with what goes on in monetary policy, is that on the other side, fiscal policy, it isn't politically independent. It isn't as fast. It's not as reversible. And it doesn't have multiple channel stimulus movements. And that's always been the caveat here, is that fiscal policy over the last 20 years particularly, or even 25 years, has been almost a net sum game and a one in, one out. It's one thing at a time rather than looking at the whole. And that is the problem, is that, again, if we are going to get a reform to actually help the overall economy move on productivity, make sure that inflation is back in check at 2 to 3% and helping the RBA get back there, we need to move a whole range of fiscal levers, not just one at a time. That means things like reform in personal income tax. That means reforms in negative gearing. It means reforms in capital gains. It means also putting in the GST. But politically, they are all very, very hot topics. And depending on which current government sits in there, whether it's centre left or centre right, they have impactors and impact views on that side. So the exchange problem is this. This is the debate. Can fiscal policy finally pick up the pieces, have the reform budget that we haven't had probably since the GST introduction way back in 96? We haven't had that level of reform for a long time, or more accurately, reforming like we saw during the Hawke and Keating eras of the 80s and early 90s. Where is the free market movement? Where is the floating of the dollar? Where is that kind of change that led to the prosperity that we have now? That is the precipice we sit on. And that is where we currently need to look, heading into what is going to be a very, very tricky week, as the RBA clearly is putting its finger over the button for the second rate rise in 2 consecutive meetings of this calendar year.